HCAM TV thanks you for watching this presentation. We'd love for you to become a member and use your creativity at our station. Please visit hinghammedia.org or call us at 781-836-5094 if you'd like to learn more.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tatsi at Buttonwood Books, our great local independent bookstore. Let's hear it for local independent bookstore. If you don't buy their books, they won't be here. So stick around. And thank you for coming out. I mean, there's lots of things that we could be doing, all different things. And so thank you for coming to this beautiful library here in Hingham. I have seen some beautiful libraries in the last year, getting to travel and do talks like this. And I want to start, first I should say I'm at the tail end of a cold, and at some point if my voice gives out, it'll be kind of a short program, but I'm pacing myself. And but I want to start, what my day job is I work at the Institute for Policy Studies. I co-edit a website called inequality.org. Most of what I do in my day job is to look at how these inequalities are affecting the different facets of our lives, the growing income and wealth inequalities of the last 30, 40 years. And I have written a number of other books, but they tend to be more about the data side of the problem. And it's only more recently that I've realized, well, some people are actually moved by data, but that most people have stories in their head that explain why we have these inequalities. Some stories are, I think, kind of mythological, some are more accurate, whatever, and that I got more interested in what are the stories that we tell ourselves about our own opportunities, advantage, challenges, and how we think about inequality. So Born on Third Base is my attempt to kind of move more into the storytelling realm. Not that I've left behind talking about the data or the facts of inequality, but to sort of get at some of that a little bit. And I start because, and the other thing is different is I talk about my own very privileged upbringing, because I know sometimes when people talk about the rich-poor gap or 99-1, there's this little bit of, nervous anxiety about is this kind of going to be a class war, class hate kind of, conversation. And I say that because, I grew up in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, which is kind of like Weston, compared to Boston. And I went to a private school, Cranbrook School. Somebody here introduced himself, Josh, said his wife went to Kingswood, which was the sister girls' school. But it's where Mitt Romney went, and he was a few years older than me. But I was genuinely confused growing up where I fit in, because in my third grade class, my classmates included Kathy Iacocca. Her dad, ran the car company. And Bill Taubman, whose father was like the biggest real estate developer in Michigan and maybe the world now. And he came to school in a chauffeur-driven car, and the chauffeur would jump out and open up the car door, and he would get out. And so I said, now, they are wealthy. My dad has to take us to school in his own Mercedes-Benz. We are middle class, So I sort of understood that third grade understanding of the world. And it wasn't that, I didn't really understand, there's old wealth, we live in a farmhouse with a barn and 5 acres, and my great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer, so my dad just used to subtly say, bringing home the bacon means something different in our family. And so I grew up, like most of us, just trying to figure out where do I fit in, except for this interesting fact, which is we live next to Detroit. And whether it was going to work with my dad, who worked downtown, going to a Detroit Tigers game, I sort of traversed that race and class divide that is Detroit and its suburbs. And when I was 7 years old, 50 years ago this summer, was when the riots, the civil unrest erupted in Detroit. And I was riveted to it. I was, looking at the newspaper and television and bugging all the adults around me, what's going on, what's going on? And it was my mom who, people could have answered, parents, adults could have answered that question a lot of different ways, but she just said, I think it has to do something with how people don't feel like things are fair in our city, that there's this huge gap. And it planted the seed in my mind that, okay, end of innocence here. The whole world is not this little bubble that I've grown up in, and it's, maybe I'm not middle class, maybe I'm sort of more near the top of the picture. And so that began the process. But, and I went to Cranbrook School and still, lived in that. By the way, our school motto was aim high, which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight up into the air, which, if you think about it, it's not something you would let your children or grandchildren do. So, and the girls' school motto was go forth and serve. So that was our gender binary. But I want to start with a story, a personal story that you might be going, wow, this story is going on for a little while. But I think it does sort of explain kind of where I came to. And then I want to talk with you sort of about what's the moment we're living in, including the political moment we're living in. How does that have to do with these inequalities? And of course, what can we do about it? And then have a good, half hour for your questions and thoughts. And I'm very grateful that Michael and Local Cable Access is also making this a conversation accessible. But it's great that you're here in person, because we just don't always have enough spaces for these kind of conversations. And I really welcome all kinds of questions and dissenting and challenging thoughts. I really love it. I thrive on it. So, but let me tell you a story that brings me here to Massachusetts, because when I graduated from high school, I was the only kid not to go straight to college. I came to Worcester from a nice Midwestern boy in Worcester, 1977. Not exactly the garden of New England at that year. It was a struggling, down on its luck Midwest, industrial city, where I had a variety of jobs. And eventually I went to college. And at the age of 26, I had my first kind of serious real job, which was I worked with mobile home park tenants. So I was living in the western part of Massachusetts, Greenfield actually. I worked with mobile home park tenants who were trying to buy their mobile home parks as cooperatives. And in the late 70s, 80s, land values were going up. And you can imagine if you lived in a mobile home park, if somebody bought your park, they could either raise the rents a lot, or they could just decide this is no longer a mobile home park, you're going to have to move your home. And what I learned from working with these residents is a mobile home isn't so mobile. If you have to move it, you could damage it. You could damage your one and only asset. So I was working in Bernardston, Massachusetts, a little 30-unit mobile home park off of Route 91 there, just south of the Vermont line. And I was sitting in the living room of Harlan and Mary Perrow. And Harlan Perrow was the retired shop steward of Greenfield Tap and Die. He had worked his entire life in Greenfield Tap and Die. He had a security clearance during World War II for whatever they were making there. He was really the organizer that got all the residents in the park together to face the fact that their park was up for sale, that there was another owner who was interested in it, and that they had this opportunity to try to buy the park themselves. And so I was sitting with 9 of the resident leaders of this park. And they had taught me a lot about kind of the plight that they were in, how vulnerable they felt, how they had made these investments in that community. Many of them had built skirts and decks, planted gardens. They had built a neighborhood. They knew each other. And it was all at risk because they didn't own the land. And one thing you should know is at the age of 26, I looked like I was about 17 still, had terrible skin acne, and most people thought I was like 17 or 18. So they are looking at me, the young guy with the bad skin who looks like he's 17 or 18, who's somehow going to be the consultant to help them pull off this resident buyout. And I had done an analysis. I knew all their financial secrets because I had sat down with every one of them. I knew what their savings were. I knew what their income was. I knew what they could afford to contribute toward a share price. And I had done that analysis. And I had done my little Lotus 1, 2, 3 spreadsheets. And I knew what they could pay. And what I had learned, and I was in agony at this meeting with these leaders because this group did not really have much money. There were like a third of the people who had like 0 or negative. There were a third of the people who were retirees, like Harlan and Mary, who maybe had modest nest eggs, but this was not a wealthy group. And I had figured they were about $35,000 short of what they needed just to have sort of the money in the bank for a down payment so they could buy the park at a reasonable price. But the other reason I was in agony was for the reason I said at the beginning, which is I was born on third base. I, at the age of 21, had inherited a trust fund that my parents had created for me that was sort of some of this family wealth trickling down to me. It had enabled me to go to college, pay my tuition checks right out of that bank account, and yet it had been growing through no effort of my own, multiplying really. And so I was thinking, you know what? I have this wealth in my name. What if I just wrote a check for that $35,000 gap? I could do it anonymously. I could just say I got a grant from somebody, and they would be able to buy the park. So I'm actually sitting there thinking that I might actually do this. It wasn't going to fundamentally change my economic circumstances. So I'm sort of in my head in that moment. So I explained to the resident leaders, here's the situation. We have this $35,000 gap. There's a little bit of quiet in the room. And then this guy Rodney says, well, I have enough to buy my share, and I have another $6,000 that I'll put in. Now I think I may be the only one who knows that he has $6,012 additional funds in his savings account. So he's basically decided to put everything he has on the table. And then this couple, the Dundorfs, say, oh, we have enough to buy our share, and we will put in $7,500. And that's like all their money. And around this group of leaders goes. Some of them have $2,000, they put it in. Some of them have $4,000, they put it in. Comes around to Harlan and Mary. Harlan says, Mary and I have talked about this. We have enough to buy our share, and we are going to buy Mrs. Rivas' share on the condition that no one will ever tell her in order to respect her dignity and privacy. And I happen to know Mrs. Rivas is one of those people who has is hanging on by a thread, who probably would have to leave the park if the rents went up $50 a month. And they are so close, they're like $5,000. And then Harlan and Mary's daughter come in. She works at a bank. She says, I'll put in the other $5,000. And they cheer. They've done it. They have raised the money, about $150,000, to put in the bank and have a down payment. And they literally start pulling out their checkbooks, writing checks out to me personally, since we don't have a group account yet, to take to the bank and open up their savings account. So they're handing me all the money they have, and I leave this meeting like my hands shaking, drive straight to the Greenfield Cooperative Bank, open up this account, and we have our down payment in the fund. And I'm like thinking, I was about to write that check, and they don't need me. They didn't need it. They did it themselves. And they succeeded. They bought the park. And a group about the size of this room, all the residents came to the closing, jammed into this law office about half the size of this room. The men had cigars, like they were proud grandparents. They were like, oh, what are we going to buy next? The Pinecone Diner is up for sale. And Harlan tells the Greenfield Recorder, we have been wandering in the desert, but we just bought the land from Pharaoh. We are hostage no more. And they are happy. And Mary comes up to me, she says, you know, you're a smart young man. You're all, what are you, 20? And I'm like, I'm 26. You could probably get a job, doing, finance in Wall Street. You could get a really good paying job. I don't see why you're hanging around with a bunch of old fogey mobile home park tenants, And I'm like, actually, I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be today. And then she sort of leaned over in a kind of maternal way. She says, have you ever tried Noxema? Yeah, I've tried Noxema. So something happened then in that process for me, which was I had never seen that kind of solidarity. I grew up in a community where people were generous, where they were charitable, but I'd never seen people be all in for each other in a way. And there was part of me that was like, I want some of that. I want what they have. I want community like that. And it started a process in my own mind, which is I had this inherited wealth. It had literally doubled between 2001 and 2006 through no effort of my own, I'm paying tuition, and the money is like multiplying, thinking, you know what, maybe I should move it along myself. Maybe I should give it away. Maybe I can find things like these mobile home parks that, you know, even with all their capacity, can't do it all alone. So I wrote my parents a letter. I said, I'm thankful for the opportunities I've had. I'm thankful for the debt-free education I've had, but I would like to move the money along. I'd like to pass the gift on. And a couple days go by, and my dad calls me from Michigan. He says, you haven't given away the money yet, have you? I said, no. He says, well, I'd like to come talk to you about that. I was like, great. So he actually came out to visit his 26-year-old son. And like any loving parent, and I have 17, 20, and 23-year-olds, so I'm always saying to them, your brain isn't developed till it's 26, you know? So anyway, you can imagine whatever my father was thinking. But he said, you know, you're young, you're single, you don't understand that bad things happen. This is it. This is your inheritance. You know, you are making a big decision at 26 when you actually haven't lived through any real rough patches. Like, what if you have a partner and that partner gets sick? Wouldn't you wish you had that money to fall back on? Or what if someday you have a child and that child has a special need? Wouldn't you wish that that wealth was there so that you would have a cushion, so maybe you could take a year off from having to work? You haven't really thought this through. I said, well, I have thought about it quite a bit, and if that happened, then I would be in the same boat as 99% of the people I know. I would have to get help. He said, right, you'd have to get help, and your friends and your family and your neighbors would help you, but in the end, you would have to fall back on government, and that is a tattered safety net. And I said, well, maybe I would have a stake in making that a better safety net. And he's like, oi. So idealistic. But he says, I understand. There's no strings attached. It's your money. Do what you have to. So, with that sort of blessing, I went a couple months later to the National Bank of Detroit. I foolishly signed over all these assets to several foundations, a couple of them in New England that continue to do good work. And there was a woman who was my trust officer at the National Bank of Detroit, a woman named Glenda Allen, who I still know, who is a civic leader in Detroit. I just saw her last week. And but at that point, I didn't really know her, except that I knew she grew up in a low-income neighborhood in Detroit. She was not born on third base by any means. And she sort of looked at me and she said, are you going to be all right? And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, everybody's sort of acting like I'm about to jump off a cliff, but I think I'm going to be okay. And the reality was I had no idea just how much other advantage I had sort of hardwired into my life. 4 generations of economic stability, family, tradition of home ownership, access to health care, being able to go to pristine environments, having access to cultural institutions and enrichment experiences, having a debt-free college education, which as we know today is a huge head start in life. I had a mountain of advantage that I still am just starting to understand. But I also had this wealth, and I didn't have it anymore. So I went back to my job. I worked with mobile home park tenants. I did that kind of work for almost 10 years. I just learned that one of the organizations I work with in New Hampshire did the 120th resident mobile home buyout in the state of New Hampshire last week. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who own the land under their mobile home parks, and they now have loan funds and board training institutes and all kinds of capacity to have flourishing communities. But I went back to my job, and a couple months went by, and then something bad happened, which is the house that I lived in burned down. Everything I owned was gone. No one was hurt, so that's the good news. But if you've ever had that happen, you've lost everything. It's very disorienting. And I lost all my love letters and photographs and everything. So the day after this event, after the firefighters have done a great job putting out the fire and pretty much, irrigating everything that I owned. My housemate Greg and I are sort of standing there, sifting through, and I look up and I see these 4 cars pull up. And out of these cars come 9 of these Bernardston mobile home tenants. And they have casseroles and trash bags and shovels. And they have come to help us put our lives back together. And that was the moment spiritually when I felt like I am going to be okay. So I share that story because that was 30 years ago. And I don't think the safety net's any better, so I may need some help if something else bad happens. But here we are today. We're living in a kind of a period of dizzying inequality. I mean, if you're paying attention, I don't have to go into the details. But the thing that I want to share personally is, really, I have watched it very intimately, starting in the 1980s. So think about that. In 1981, between 1981 and 86, I watched my own wealth basically double and then double again in about a 6 or 7 year period. But I'm working with these mobile home park tenants just at the time when real wages in the United States start to flatten out. After World War II, we really did have this rising tide lifting all wages. The incomes of the bottom fifth went up along with the incomes of the top fifth, roughly the same. And the rising tide was lifting all boats, and we'd left a lot of people of color behind after the World War II, but those gaps were starting to close. We were starting to become a middle-class society without these levels of inequality. And then starting in the late 70s and 80s, real wages started to stagnate. And you may have seen several French economists, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman just did a report a month ago showing that really since the late 70s, the size of the economy has doubled. The real wages of the bottom half of the society have virtually stayed the same since the late 70s. And this was not abstract to me because I was seeing this over a 10-year period in the lives of the people I was working with, who we were trying to shoehorn into these resident buyouts, and where I'm looking at their personal financial data week after week after week and trying to figure that out. So I had this intimate front row seat to what happens when real wages start to flatten out. And how is it that people survive? They survive by working more hours, more people in the household working, taking on debt, getting those credit card offers in the mail and actually sending them back, which is, many people hadn't done that, but they started to because that was how they were going to hold on to what they had. At the same time, I'm in a wealthy family, I have this extended community, I have my people that I go back to in Bloomfield Hills, and they're like, yeah, we just sold our house for 10 times what we paid for it, and we bought 2 more houses, and those investment funds are returning 25% a year. And so I'm also having this very intimate personal front row seat to wealth creating wealth. So I'm seeing that happening. And that's what led me to found an organization 22 years ago, co-founded called United for a Fair Economy, that did a lot of popular education on these issues of inequality. And so here's the picture. We're in this period of inequality. I think, I explain the election that we just lived through, which is that this is the inequality election. That the undercurrent of what happened is a function of the fact when you have a polarized economy where half the society feels as if they have been left behind, you have a polarized politics. It gives rise to a populism. It can be a progressive populism, the Bernie Sanders, the billionaires, the people, are the big corporations, dominating, fixing the rules, or a regressive populism, where you look at, new immigrants, people of color, Muslims, you deflect and your resentments you onto others. That's the history of regressive populism. It's actually the history of anti-Semitism. It's the oldest story in the book. It's the Great Deflection. During the first Gilded Age, 100 years ago, the last time we had inequalities as great as this, we had both a progressive populist response, this sort of rural prairie fire populism that got us the income tax and the inheritance tax, that ended child labor, and urban reformers coming together to realign and create a different set of rules for the economy. But there was also the rise of nativism, the rise of the Klan. The same forces were underway. The progressive populist forces won out ultimately. And so we entered into a period where after World War II, we had this great blossoming of a shared prosperity economy. But I would argue that that the undercurrent that has given rise to this are these inequalities, are the insecurities, and what we're living through. And I would say that the current, everything that I see, the current regime isn't going to address the underlying drivers of these inequality. There'll be a lot of symbolic and a lot of deflection, but it's not fundamentally going to address the trends that we're living through. And so the pressure will continue to build. It could go either way. And in a way, that is where it's up to us, where we have some role in that. The current inequality we're living with, I mentioned wages. Real wages have been flat for a huge percentage of the society. But the other marker I like to look at is wealth and assets. And we are seeing an extraordinary concentration of wealth at the top. You know, since the economic meltdown less than a decade ago, most of the income and wealth gains have gone not just to the top 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. And the flow of wealth, the higher up the ladder you go, the more kind of astounding it becomes. So, you know, the Forbes 400 has as much wealth as the bottom 62%, 400 individuals, all billionaires. Combined wealth is equal to about 62% of the population. The wealthiest 20, enough that could sit, you know, on this side of the room in a 650 Gulfstream 650 jet, have as much as the bottom half. That is because the number of households with zero or negative net worth keeps climbing steadily. The home ownership rate in this country has been, for 10 years, going down. You know, no good can come from that. The wealthiest 100 people have as much wealth as the entire African American population, 14 million households. That tells us something about black wealth. And if we put a racial lens on it, the median white wealth is 13 times more than the median black wealth, 10 times more than the median Latino wealth. So we have these deep inequalities with a racial twist to it. If we ask the question, where is this taking us, it gets even more a little bit troubling. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, some of you may have seen the book Capital. It's like 700 pages. Some of you may own it. Some of you may even have tried to read it. Some of you have it still in your house. You know, here's this book by a French economist that was like selling up there with Danielle Steele, you know. Well, what's going on here? Well, one of the things he says is, look, if we don't intervene sort of in the cycles of the rules that essentially generate these inequalities, where the return to capital keeps going faster than the return to work, we're moving toward a hereditary aristocracy of wealth where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, our culture, our philanthropy, and our economy. We may not have to wait a generation, but that's the warning. And then if you put the racial lens on it, the racial wealth divide, and we did a study, my institute did a study on the racial wealth divide, if the last 30 years play out into the future, the racial wealth divide, average wealth between whites and blacks, the gap will grow, the average will be $1 million. So by 2043, when this country is a majority country of people of color, we will be a racial and economic apartheid society. So that is our rallying moment here. That is because what I would argue, and what I argue in Born on Third Base, is this is not good for anyone. There is no one who is going to benefit if we go to that level of polarization. And so again, I've come back to my people, people who grew up in my circumstances or people who are in the top 5% or 10%, and I'm saying these extreme inequalities will undermine everything we care about. It's obviously not good for poor people and working people and middle income people, but it's actually going to undermine the quality of life for everybody. It's going to create volatility in the economy. If you have an economy where working people and middle income people don't have income to stimulate the economy, where there isn't the aggregate demand, the spending power, that creates sort of cycles of debt and debt collapse. And at the high end, you have wealthy people with so much money that they're looking for investments, and it creates volatility and speculation, and it creates, according to the International Monetary Fund, it's actually bad for growth. It's bad for capitalism. It's bad for healthy economic life. If you put an ecological overlay on this, which is to say we can't keep going the way we are, that what I've said to, my people is there is no wealth on a degraded earth. There's no wealth if soil and the waters, fresh waters are damaged. If the pollinators don't come back, there is no wealth. That is the earth is the basis of wealth. We might think it has to do with paper trading, but it isn't. So it is now an interesting moment, which is it is in everyone's interest to not allow that trajectory, to change that trajectory in a very, very intervene. The sooner we intervene, the better. So there's a lot we can do on that. But one thing I find, and I want to just share one more story and sort of hear your thoughts, is people hear that data that I've shared, and they say, wow, that's troubling. But other people say, these inequalities are the price we pay to have a dynamic free market economy. We want to have a society that rewards people who work hard. And if we start to gum up the works, we will also lose something. There'll be an unintended consequence there. And other people say, I'm not that troubled by those statistics because the people at the top produce a huge amount of wealth. They are engines of economic development, and without them, we would be impoverished. And those folks deserve the rewards they get. And I come from a family enterprise where actually I do understand how people work hard and make sacrifices. My great-grandfather, with an 8th grade education, started a business where he worked all his life so he could leave something for his children. I understand, we even generations later, that's very much a part of my own family story. But what I believe is that these inequalities are now delinked from, they are distortions. These are delinked from the stories of individual merit and deservedness, and that yet those stories continue to be very powerful. So I do a lot of talk radio, I don't know why, just to atone for something. And people call in all the time and just say, I built this business. I didn't get any help. I don't really want to pay taxes, so some other person who hasn't worked hard should get a free ride. I hear that story all the time. The story of, the I did it alone story. How do you change that? Because my experience is you can present all the data you want, but if somebody has a powerful story of deservedness, it's not that easy to change or have a conversation even. So here's what I've learned about that. A couple of years ago, I was part of an effort to defend the estate tax from being abolished. George W. Bush became president. He said, I'm going to abolish the estate tax. I got a call from this guy, Bill Gates, Sr., the father of the founder of Microsoft, who said, I heard you're trying to defend the estate tax. I've always wanted to organize millionaires and billionaires to defend the estate tax. How can I help you? And I'm like, whoa, okay, so we can lobby Congress, we can write articles, we can write a book together, which we did. And we could draft a petition calling on wealthy individuals to step up and defend the estate tax. And he signed on to all of that. And I drafted this petition, and he said, okay, I'll go. I said, I'll go to, Judy Wicks, this restaurant owner, and Martin Rothenberg, this software engineer. And he said, I'll get Warren Buffett and George Soros and Paul Newman and Agnes Gunn. She owns a lot of art that she's going to give to the Met because of the estate tax, and I'll get her to sign on. And I'm like, great, you work your network and I'll work my network. And so anyway, we did all these events, press conferences on why we should retain the estate tax, which today only is on household wealth over $11 million. And so at one of these press conferences, this guy stood up, who is one of our spokespeople, and I introduced him. He's Martin Rothenberg. He actually started a voice recognition software company. And he said, I will have to pay the estate tax. I don't have a problem with that. Here's why. He says, I grew up in a low-income family. My parents worked their entire lives. They never took a vacation my entire childhood. But I went to a great public school. I had teachers who were great. I went to high school, and I went to a library that was open on the weekends and evenings, and there was a librarian there who took an interest in me. Every time I came in, she said, Martin, I have a book for you. She knew I was interested in science and technology. She had a biography of Thomas Edison. She had a book of experiments I could do in my house without burning it down. He said, I had a great education. Someone else paid for my education. Someone else paid to have that library stay open so I could go there after school. And then I went to college, and I got a full scholarship. Someone else paid for me to go to college. Then I went into the field of high technology, which was being built through public investments. And I started a company. And where did I hire my employees? I hired them from the great public universities of our land, which were training people on all these computer science issues. Someone else paid to train my workers. And then early on, a foreign corporation stole my patents, stole my intellectual property, was going to put me out of business offshore, creating my product. The United States government went to the World Court to defend my intellectual property and won, saving my business. He says, somebody else paid for this infrastructure of property law protections and institutions. And he says, I sold my company last year for $30 million, and I have several other companies. So if you abolish the estate tax, what you're effectively saying is, I have no obligation to pay back the society that made it almost entirely possible for me. He says, and actually starts pounding the table at this moment, I have a moral obligation to pay back the society so some other kid out there who's not born rich, who's born just like me into a low-income family can have the same opportunities I have. Because what a great society does is it recycles opportunity. And you're so lucky that you, like me, have 10, 20, $50 million, then you have an obligation to pay back the society. That's why I support the estate tax. He sits back down and everybody's like, wow, how often do you hear that story? Well, I hear those stories all the time now. And part of why I wrote Born on Third Base is to lift them up. Because those stories tell us is individuals matter. It matters what each of us does. But we live and operate in a society surrounded by a web of commonwealth that makes almost this possible. It's the fertile ground we create together. If we disinvest the fertile ground, then we start to lose some of that opportunity. So I think that those are the stories that we want to celebrate in an American way, individual effort, and see the web that makes it possible. So my book concludes with an invitation, which is to my people who are in a position where you have wealth and power and opportunity, to bring the wealth home, to come home, to commit to a place, not like an enclave, but a region, and address the great inequalities and inequities in a place. To bring the wealth home, bring it out of the offshore tax havens where like 8% of the wealth of the rich now resides. Bring it out of the complicated trusts that put it outside the reach, pay our taxes, invest in the real economy, divest from this fossil fuel sector, which is very focused on short-term profits at the expense of the habitability of the earth, reinvest in the real, healthy, new emerging economy that's emerging all over around us, local food systems and energy systems, locally owned businesses. Give charitably, but realize that charitable giving is not a substitute for an adequately funded public sector. Personally address, make the fact that young people have an average of $33,000 of student debt, personally be offended by that and do whatever you can to bring us back to a society where there really is the kind of opportunity. So that's my invitation. And the other part of the invitation is demystify wealth. Tell true stories of advantage. You know, I say to my dad, Dad, you got the GI Bill after World War II, a 40-year, 1% fixed rate mortgage? How come people don't talk about that? That's what launched 1,000 households into the middle class, next generations. To everyone else, my message is, this is actually a time where we have to wake up, come together, join organizations, find places to think about how can each of us use our gifts to, to stop bad things from happening. We'll talk more about this. Build a new and healthy economy, protect the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, build a wall around it if we have to. Work to raise the floor, raise the minimum wage, address the student debt crisis, address the deep inequalities and poverties that challenge our communities. But I want you to remember that there are wealthy people who are potential allies in these movements. And this is important because when I go to the ironworkers local in South Boston, they're just like, let's just get the pitchforks out. So we have to understand, there is a segment of wealthy people who are using their wealth and power to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. That's a small segment. And there's lots of other people who are behind the scenes doing amazing work to build equity in education and to lift up people, and they don't toot their horns very much. And there's a lot of very generous people. There's people like the Patriotic Millionaires who are actually organizing to speak out against policies that worsen inequality. And then there's a lot of people who are just not engaged, but are waking up. In this moment, they are waking up. My partner Mary was the founder of the Boston Women's March. She was like, I don't want to go to Washington. I'm just going to put up a Facebook page. Maybe we can, get 5,000 people in a bullhorn at the band shell, literally. She put up this Facebook page. 2 days later, there were 6,000 people coming. She's like, honey, I got to get some help. 200,000 people showed up, right? So she's like, we gave her a little standing ovation in our church. Sally and I go to church together, So it's like, okay, she was like, for a month and a half, all she did was answer calls and emails from people who were like, where do I get tickets to the march? It's like, you've never been to a march, have you? No. Most of those people had not been to a march. That's interesting. So we are waking up. There's like awakening happening. And I think that's powerful and good news. And these inequalities are not going to get fixed by the current program being put forward. So the pressure will continue to build, and the pressure for some kind of realignment will grow. So let me stop there. One thing I just want to say is a little sales pitch, which is I co-edit this website, inequality.org, and I send out a little monthly newsletter on what people can do. And we always try to have a sense of humor, and we talk about the horror, the hope, and the humor of these inequalities. So if you're interested, you can sign up. I'll send you the newsletter. If you don't like it, you can always cancel, right? So I'm just going to pass this around while we talk. All right, my voice is holding up. What thoughts, questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So, the corporate incentives have been more towards the executives really getting more, stock options. And that, I think, also happened in about the 1780s. So for them, trying to raise the minimum wage is not going to get their options. But how do you change that? Because it's all being driven by, how the quarter performs and how you're going to do the meet their target. So So how do you change that?
So he asked a good question about sort of what about the incentives within inside corporations and businesses? Did the gap or the inequalities open up in the 80s? And how do you address something like that? It's an excellent question. It's true that the ratio between sort of top and bottom workers in 1980 was like 32 to 1. And then it's gone up over 500 to 1. It sort of bounces around now between 300 and 400 to 1. And yeah, part of it is there's no, I mean, there's no social contract to, we've lived through a period where there's been huge productivity gains, but most of those productivity gains have gone to capital and not to labor. Labor's bargaining power has steadily been declining for 50 years. After World War II, 35% of workers were in a union. Now it's less than 10%. But there are some things we can do. One is now shareholders, our organization actually worked to get, as part of the Dodd-Frank financial reform, a provision of disclosure where corporations have to disclose the ratio between top and bottom. They have to use so starting in the next year, corporations will disclose that number. And that will, people can make decisions on their own about that. This is just a transparency reform. Running a large, giant global corporation is a complicated endeavor. Those require leadership skills, and those leaders should be rewarded. But the question is, at some point, is it just sort of an inside job, if you will? There's lack of accountability. It's not, many shareholders would like to see the ratios close. There's a lot of, performance data that shows the bigger the gap, the more rewards, that management is not being accountable and is too independent. So there's a number of reasons why people consider it a red flag, excessive compensation. One thing that people are doing is proposing a cap on the tax deductibility of excessive pay over a certain level. And then the city of Portland did an interesting thing, which it passed an ordinance in November, basically saying that corporations that do business in the city of Portland, not just based there, but have, outlet stores or whatever, if their CEO pay ratio is above a certain threshold, I can't remember what it is, maybe 100 to 1, there's an extra municipal corporate tax surcharge. This is Portland, Oregon. But after that passed, about 120 other cities wanted to implement the same thing. So there are things that we can do at the national level, and people are exploring things that we can do at the local level. But it is ultimately about changing some of the incentives that drive that. And as shareholders, if you do get social issue proxies, there are resolutions around compensation now where you can weigh in. So those things all matter to the drivers there. Other question, comment? Yes, sir.
In light of that, what do you think about the movement towards B corporations, creating a structural, ethics-oriented way of approaching corporate governance?
Yeah, this question is about what do I think about creating a B corporation, which is kind of creating another class of corporate entity. I think it's a great idea, and I'm excited by the states that are doing it because they're essentially saying, we're going to create a class of corporations that operate by a sort of triple bottom line, that both have profitability, but also are concerned about social responsibility and community responsibility. So they march to a different set of incentives, and they have a separate charter. So corporations are chartered at state level. So we can have in Massachusetts a corporation that fulfills this charter, and perhaps that becomes, we sort of lift up. And to the extent we are looking at contracting decisions or tax status or incentives and subsidies, that we preference corporations that are more socially responsible. So I think it's a good idea, and I think it's a movement where I think about 15 states now have created this new status. So it's a great example of how do we get at the wiring. I think looking at how to expand broader ownership. You probably saw the owner of Chobani Yogurt, gave 10% of the company to his employees. In Massachusetts, there are lots and lots of either worker-owned or where there's worker stakeholder interests in companies. It definitely broadens out wealth ownership. And there's all these private companies that are transitioning, owned by baby boomers or transitioning. We want to create a glide path where those can move to broader ownership when that's appropriate. So expanding that worker ownership sector, and there's a terrific leader who wrote a book called Owning the Future. Anybody help me out there? Anyway, so it'll come to me. But anyway, she's launched an initiative, she lives in Salem, called 50 by 50, 50 million worker owners, Marjorie Kelly, Owning the Future, 50 million worker owners by 2050, which is basically saying a huge percentage of the workforce has broader ownership stakes. And that's another way to get at the machineries that create inequality and reduce them. Yeah.
Everything you said has given me a lot of hope that people, individuals, and good-hearted souls who have finally understand what you're talking about. I'm talking about the wealthy. And but right now, we're in a very difficult period that a lot of us are trying to get our minds around. And I'd like to hear what you're saying, that we, the people and individuals, do have the power to do these things. I mean, on the march, and yes, when we're out there, thousands of people, yes, we feel very empowered. But when we have a government, how much should we worry about the government of this country hindering what we are trying to do when we feel that there's no ear to hear what we're saying?
Yeah. Be afraid is probably one way to think about it, but or be wary. But you know, it's been a roller coaster week. I mean, it's good that we're together, and I would say one of the important things to do is to have a posse, have a group of people who you can face-to-face connect with in the coming weeks and years, where we talk about what is it we notice that's going on, what are we called to do, what are the things that we should be weighing in on and keeping each other apprised. But I think that it's a really good time to do that, to think of one other person, maybe somebody who's here with you is the start of that, and then get a couple people and get together, because I think there are going to be some very highs and some very lows. I mean, and then some of it's thinking, what am I called to do? What level of witness am I capable of being part of? What can we contribute to financially or with volunteer energy? What are the moments when we really need to be showing up and helping and going together with others? So see it as a way to build community, and if you're part of a religious congregation or association or a book group, you have the basis of that. So you use it as sort of a support group. And there's a wonderful thinker, Joanna Macy, who says, now we have to think about the stop the bad, right? So the holding actions. I have never seen a more emotional mayor of Boston than I did today. And I was there, and I was crying. I could not believe. He said, I don't know if you heard, he said, anybody who feels like they're at risk of deportation, you can come to my office. You can stay in my office. I will protect you. This is Marty Mayor Walsh, stood on the steps of the City Hall. He said, we're not going to let this happen. Boston is a sanctuary city. And he's not alone. So he woke up and that said, this is what I'm called to do. What are each of us called to do? I think it's going to require extraordinary witness. One of this gentleman here and my 20-year-old daughter were arrested in a trench in West Roxbury, along with Al Gore's daughter, trying to stop this pipeline that did get built. But they didn't think that's what they wanted to do with their lives, but that's what they were called to do. Not everybody's called to do that. Other people are called to organize the letter writing campaign here at the public library or at the Congregational church or whatever. So so there's the stop. But then there's also the build. We are not just stoppers, we are builders. We have to build the beloved community where we are, put our stake down, continue the work of our commonwealth, you know. And there's a lot we can still do together. And then there's sort of like solidarity with people in states where, you know, and learning, and, you know, people have said, oh, I'm tired of hearing the word empathy, particularly as it's applied toward people who voted for Donald Trump. But I actually think we do need to figure out how to stop caricaturing people. I know a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump. I, you know, have all this northern Michigan connections. I grew up in hunting culture in northern Michigan, grew up in, you know, with people who are evangelical Christians. Actually, one of my favorite books, it's probably here in the library, is called Deer Hunting with Jesus by Joe Bejant, which is about the white working class and why they don't feel like the Democratic Party has heard what they're saying, why they feel invisible. And Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land. Arlie says, I'll just take a minute, Arlie says, here's the deep story. Why is it that people voted for Trump? She spent 5 years in Louisiana going to, you know, Cajun cook-offs and church and interviewing people and listening to people's stories. And she said, here's the deep story. Here's why these folks supported Donald Trump. Says, imagine, now this is your empathy moment. You don't have to stay in it if you don't want to. Let's try it. Imagine you're standing in line, a long line to the American dream. And it's going up a hill, and over the hill is the American dream. And you are faithful, and you work hard, and you may have made sacrifices, you may have served in the military, and you're patient, and you're waiting in line, but that line is not moving. In fact, it's starting to back up. And then someone tells you, probably some sleazy politician, but whoever told you that there are people cutting in line ahead of you. And they are black, and they're brown, and they're Muslim, and they're cutting in line. And at the head of that line are, you heard this from a reliable TV source, that at the head of that line is Barack Obama and the liberal coastal elites and the Democratic Town Committee of Hingham. All those people are there, and they're letting those people cut in line. They're encouraging people to cut in line, and when you complain about it, they call you a racist and a deplorable and all kinds of other things. But you're not. You're not a racist. You actually work and live alongside more people of color than these northern liberals who are looking down their nose at you. You just don't like it when people cut in line. You want it to be fair, and you feel like it's not been fair. And along comes the Tea Party in Louisiana, along comes Donald Trump, and he says, I see you, and I'm going to do something for you. These people have been ignoring you long enough. Boom. That's the deep story. That's emotionally how people feel. And Arlie, who's a brilliant sociologist, tested that story out with people, and they said, that's how I feel. Now, what's the implication of that? One, we've got to get the line moving again. If wages are stagnant, if there isn't shared prosperity, that is the seed for all the resentment. You know, we do have a default to racism and xenophobia under stress. It's like it's the Enneagram, if any of you know that. You know, under stress, you go over here. But the other thing that's important is actually to engage in conversation with people. You know, there's a lot of people of color been waiting in line for a long time. They're not cutting in line. It's the way the rules of the economy have been tilted now to benefit asset owners at the expense of wage earners. It's structural. And people of color, some of them have been waiting longer. You're in the same boat. Bottom 50%. White, black, brown, together. First Nations. You're waiting to get the economy moving again. And the third thing is for us to find, if we have the capacity, the ability to listen and engage and understand the underlying issues that people are dealing with. And that's where, you know, reading Deer Hunting with Jesus, I think, is part of, you know, so then, yeah, you do talk to that brother that you don't always talk to about politics. You find a way to engage with people, or you have a connection to another place in northern New England, and you get to know people. I grew up in Michigan, and I was just spent 4 days there this week, and I was in northern Michigan in the UP, where, you know, half the people are going to get thrown off of Affordable Care Act, and they all voted for Trump. How do we sort of eat? And they actually think there's a difference between Affordable Care Act and Obamacare. Okay, I'm sorry, I don't want to insult anyone, but we got to just be in relationship. So anyway, that's my thought on that. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for coming here tonight. It was very enlightening, Stephen. I just want to tell everybody that we are taking some action on the South Shore. We've
Great.
formed a new group called South Shore Action. We've invited the Attorney General, Maura Healey, to come out to Derby Academy next Monday night at 7 o'clock. And you have to register though to go there. And I think you could go on her website and register. So I want to invite everybody to get involved.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, others should feel free to, yeah.
So there are a lot of us in this room who are trying to make the Democratic Party become more relevant to Canadian voters. What I don't know about and haven't seen are there people in the Republican Party who are trying to take back a segment of the Republican Party to something that makes more sense for the whole country. You know more of those people than I do. But, I mean, our governor is kind of okay on some of this stuff.
Right.
So not so good on pipelines yet. We're working on some of that. So I guess I need to feel encouraged that there's something happening on the other side of the aisle that we can then work with at some point.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of fluidity, that the party structures are kind of much more volatile and really different region by region, state by state. That's my experience. I think there's a large segment of Republicans who are kind of holding their, they didn't support Trump. They're like our governor. They kind of are excited about maybe part of what the agenda that might finally move, because they do have some things they want to happen at the national level. But at a certain point, Donald Trump is not going to be an asset anymore. And, he might be an impediment even to various segments of the Republican agenda. And so there's going to be some realignments. I think it's a very interesting and volatile time. So I actually think that's good news, because things are sort of stuck. I think to the extent we can find issues that connect with the underlying grievances of some segments of the Trump voters, stagnant wages, exclusion from participation in the economy, those are, like in South Dakota, which overwhelmingly voted for Trump, the same ballot, same election, overwhelmingly voted for an anti-predatory lending or legislation in the state, an initiative to outlaw certain kinds of predatory lending. So I think there's sort of areas where we can find interesting common ground, and we should look for those and look for allies. And then I think we should keep the channels open with the sort of Baker wing of the Republican Party, who have a very different view toward governing and policy and politics, and be in relationship with those folks. Because I think there's part of that realignment moment maybe come sooner than we think. So I think we might want to be ready for that. Yeah. Yes, and then yeah.
One of the most discouraging things I find in the story that you told, if I can just work from that story, is that people are waiting in line, and somebody tells them Obama is letting people cut in the line, and they believe it. And there's nothing that will change their mind about that. We have our reality, they have their reality. I don't know how you, especially when you have big media organizations that proliferate non-truth.
This is a whole new terrain, right? I'm with you. And there's just going to be limits to how relational, conversational interaction can shift that. But it's something we have some control over, is how we talk to one another, and the art of asking questions. So do you really think? I have a brother who actually is my closest heartfelt relative. He's the one who, for some reason, I have the deepest heart connection, but he lives in Texas, and he is Fox News man. and but we have conversations, and I'm trying to work on my artful question, my artful, thoughtful questions to him. Like, so is this really going to fix the things that you see are broken? So I think that matters, and I think we're going to have to learn the art of courageous conversations and asking good questions and listening, and not lecturing, and trying to meet people where they are. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody has to be deputized to do that. Not all of you have the temperament to do it. Whatever, but if it's a possibility, I encourage that as part of your discipleship, or whatever you want to use the word of. Yeah.
I have two concerns. First of all, I'm noticing that the demographic in the room tonight is definitely skewed to over 50, probably over 60 actually. And I think to myself, where are the rest of the people who are going to be coming along to carry the ball? I mean, that really concerns me. I mean, we're talking, the whole 30 to 55, 60-year-old, are they checked out? Do they not care? Do they not want to know? Are they too
They're
busy
home
to?
doing their dishes and putting their kids to bed. But
Oh no,
that's all well and good. but
Yeah.
A lot of young people are fired up.
Good news on this front.
Okay.
I mean, first of all, demographically, age-wise, Trump did not get, across every segment, did not get the youth vote, did not get the 35 and under.
No, that doesn't
30.
surprise me.
And that those folks are starting to understand very clearly how these inequalities are cutting generationally. And I think part of our work, actually I should have said this right up front, is to support these emerging movements that are going to come in the next couple of years that are going to be led by younger people. They're going to need our help. They're going to need our financial support. They're going to need our mentoring and safe houses, whatever. They're going to need us, and that's part of our work. And I have the experience of talking to, sort of age segmented groups, but I've been doing a lot on college campuses, and things are, as you say, people are fired up. Younger people gravitated to that, curmudgeonly guy from Vermont, and the reason was he talked about these inequalities. He talked about them from a generational point of view. He could have done more to talk about sort of the racial dimensions of the inequalities we're living in. If he had been able to start his campaign earlier and figured out how to address that, he could have built an even bigger kind of a rainbow populist coalition. But the good news is that those people didn't go away. They didn't just vaporize. They're there. They're looking at all kinds of ways to be engaged. So I have 3 of them. They're on fire. That's the good news. That's actually a huge, important piece of the story right now.
What I was encouraging on the march to Washington, and my daughter, who's 26, spent several $100s to get to D.C. And when you saw the young people, many kids made sacrifices financially and time-wise to go down there and show up. I mean, the same thing on Boston Common. I thought it was a mix, but there were young people there. So I mean, I think they are in some ways putting their money where their mouth is
Yeah.
by showing up. at
Well,
those marches.
especially women who are concerned about reproductive rights.
That's a huge
I mean,
issue.
that's already an age-defined.
Right, I heard that from my daughter, the 20-something, who's very concerned about that and very much feels under siege
Yeah.
because of the attitude.
I mean, the next week is going to feel like whack-a-mole, because every day there's going to be like 2, gut punches. So that's part of like how we are going to. But I think supporting younger people to stay engaged, to do what they need to do. I mean, I was a marshal, and I just stood at the corner of Beacon and Charles as the march was sort of trying to move, and I just was mostly looking for people who were looking claustrophobic and needed to get out of there. But I was just struck by the generosity, the number of young people there, the number of children there with these incredibly thoughtful, crafted signs. I mean, it showed a part. You know what the previous biggest march on the Boston Common was? 1969, George McGovern, 100,000 people. Just doubled it. Just made history by 100%. So, you know, and there's a generation of people who were there for whom that will be a formative moment. But there will be other moments when we're going to need to show up like that. And I think, yes, back there, and then I'm sorry.
I hear people being anxious about what's going on. I think historical perspective is also helpful. Going back a little bit, you know, we had who I previously thought was an amazing knucklehead, George W. Bush, but he was just bad enough that the country decided that we take his hands on this black guy with a funny name. That didn't so then Donald to him, well, what's going to be the next one? I think the next election is going to be the definitive election of our lifetimes as we try to recover from this and spin the story. And in year 3, I worked as a not terribly important speechwriter, but a speechwriter for Bill Bradley back in the day when he was running. And the idea is to try to tell a story, because all this stuff is just too much to get your head around. You need the story. And the Republicans have their story from the day of Ronald Reagan, which is other people, it's not fair, other people are getting fun of it. We need to build our story so that when the next election happens, we're allowed to go. We have to get good candidates so we don't concede all this stuff. The other thing is I saw Talking Points memo, it's a decent website that has a lot of stuff, and they showed how we got so clobbered in this last election and we lost. Never before have we been so down Democrats in the Senate and the Congress and the White House and in all the governorships and all the state legislatures. Because the last time we said that is 1929. Well, if you look at it, 1930 was when we had, when things were total disaster, we rethought the whole process at the end of the deal. So we need to start thinking that next thing, although at the smallest possible level, but also on bigger levels. Because this guy's bad, he's gonna, I feel like it's like a 13-year-old who stole the bus. He's like drunk and happy and he's gonna drive.
And how much
Like, there's no way
damage is
this
it
thing
gonna
is well.
do?
Right.
So we're gonna let him, give him enough rope, he'll take an enormous number of the Republicans with him. His Republican establishment, Charlie Baker, will be lucky to walk away from this. And that he only won, there's a million people difference between what happened with Barack Obama and what happened now. It's a tiny perspective.
I think it's a very
Get our
important.
game together, we can, this is a big deal.
Yeah.
And there's big opportunities.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for that comment. Yes.
So I wanted to ask, in terms of, moving towards the common good and getting people to separate from their money for the common good, would you, in all your work with inequality, what is the surefire way to help close this gap? Is it contributing and donating to job retraining, education, housing? I mean, do we spend our time lobbying Congress, or do we look on Charity Navigator for the people with the most effective outcome to closing this gap?
Yeah.
Where should we invest our money?
I think one short, quick answer to that is, let's look at what we did after World War II. We had a progressive income tax. We taxed incomes and assets, inheritances at higher levels. They don't have to be as high as then, and we invested in public goods. The public education, the debt-free education system, the GI Bill, the first-time homebuyer investment programs that launched a generation of white homeowners. That should be part of our playbook. Is look, we've done this before. We know how to reduce inequality. We know how to create middle-class prosperity. It was racially exclusive. It can't be in the future. The other thing is to look at the Nordic model. There's a great new book out called Viking Economics, What We Can Learn from the Scandinavians by George Lakey, that will sort of turn on end some of your stereotypes. These are vibrant free market capitalist economies that have a higher social floor, with minimal income guarantees, job retraining. People fall through the floor, but not anywhere near as many as fall through the floor in our society. And then they have a progressive tax system that invests in public goods that's widely supported because wealthy people benefit from living in a more stable society where their children can also go to school without taking on huge amounts of debt, where there's health insurance, long-term care planning, job retraining. The rates of entrepreneurship in those Nordic countries is much higher per capita than the US because you don't have to be wealthy to take a risk. So in the end, I would say it's about public policies that reduce inequality. Now, at the federal level, we're going to have a wall for a while in terms of But in states are doing interesting, innovative stuff. Washington State took its state inheritance tax, dedicated all the revenue to an education legacy trust fund for debt-free education in Washington State. This is a regressive state that does not have an income tax, where when it went to the ballot to be repealed, 62% of Washington voters said, let's keep the tax on inherited wealth because it's going to something that we trust and we think is good. In 2018, we in the Commonwealth will get to vote on the Fair Share Amendment, which is a change in the state constitution to add a second income tax bracket for incomes over $1 million, a 4% increase that will generate $2.4 billion for dedicated education and transportation infrastructure. It's going to apply to 19,000 households. It's going to raise a lot of money, and it's going to the ballot. I would love to see us overwhelmingly pass that as a powerful statement of commonwealth, and that's what good societies do. And we have the top taxpayers in the state pay a significantly smaller share of their income than the bottom fifth of taxpayers, state and local and sales taxes if you add the whole mix together. So that's something we can work on. So I do think giving to charity is important, but I would encourage it to support the organizing to change the rules. And in Born on Third Base, I actually have a couple of chapters about the power of charity and the limits of charity. And actually, I just did a study called Gilded Giving, Top-Heavy Philanthropy in an Age of Extreme Inequality, which is an interesting trend, which is low and moderate income giving is steadily declining, and more giving is being done by very, very wealthy households. So play that out into the future, and you have these mega foundations that are sort of like bastions of private power, some of them doing good work, and some of them reinforcing the status quo. So I don't think charity is the answer. It is part of the answer, but it's not a substitute. So I sort of try to tackle that very difficult question. But I also wrote a book called Robin Hood Was Right, A Guide to Giving Your Money for Social Change, which is sort of about how to be really strategic and smart and support the kind of campaigns. And there's a lot of work, obviously, in the current moment that if you have extra money could use support. So that's a little long-winded, but it's my take on that. Maybe one other question, and then we'll, yeah. Back. I think this is a really important time to stand with unions and workers in general. So, as we know, there's a larger and larger segment of the workforce that's not in a union. By the way, the union stepped up to make the Boston Women's March happen, just like the union of Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Workers made the March on Washington happen in 1963. The unions are, to the extent we have a infrastructure to get people together, they're important institutions. The fight for 15 in the state, in Born on Third Base, I tell the story of going back to my old hometown of Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, where I met this woman who was standing with her leg in a cast. And she said, I just try to show up whenever Jobs with Justice or one of these local worker rights groups needs me. I can't really stand very well, but I just go there and I accompany them because I want them to know they're not alone. And so when the Hyatt workers get shut out, or when people are trying to basically just sort of protect the standard of living they have, and we could probably get into a roiling discussion about the good, bad, and the ugly of unions, but workers and the standard of living have been under siege for 30 years, particularly unions in private sector. So to the extent you can stand, and then there's all these formations of low-wage workers who aren't in a union but are who need people to accompany them in their journey for justice. So I think that's another. Sometimes we can't fix something, but we can accompany people, and I think that's an important role. So finding out, there's a great group, Jobs with Justice, in Eastern Massachusetts. You can get on their mailing list and you can learn about, where is it helpful to show up and where is it helpful to weigh in, you know. Should we, maybe if I could, I'll close with one little story though, and then I would invite you to, you know, support your local bookstore. I'm happy to inscribe the book. If you have a, you know, someone who couldn't be here tonight, or your favorite cousin who's in the 1%, I'm happy to give them the book. But I wanted to tell you a story, which is a couple, maybe about a year ago now. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in this huge protest in support of a financial transaction tax, what they call a Wall Street tax. Now, how many of you have ever been part of a giant march in favor of a good tax idea? Okay, not many. There are 6,000 people marching to the idea is a 1 penny tax on every $4 of financial transactions. This is actually how Senator Bernie Sanders' proposal for a debt-free college education would have been paid for by this very modest financial transaction tax, which will mostly affect high-speed trading. So I'm out there in this sea of people. Now, the reason there are 6,000 people is because like 5,500 of them are nurses. Any of you nurses? Okay, we have National Nurses Association has decided that this financial transaction tax is a great policy idea. It would generate huge amounts of revenue. And so I'm in this march and I'm walking along. The reason I know that there are 5,500 are nurses is because they all have red shirts. And the shirts say, if you save a life, you're a hero. If you save 100 lives, you're a nurse. And they're holding up placards that say, "Heal America, Tax Wall Street." So there are a sea of people walking through the streets. And I see this woman walking along, and I'm just chatting with her. I said, "Where are you from?" She says, "Taunton." I said, "Taunton? In Washington?" We're like we're related, you know? And you know, I tell her, "Jamaica Plain, where do you work?" "I work at Taunton City Hospital." "Great," you know. So I just said, "What's your name?" "Eleanor." She said, "Eleanor, why are you here?" She says, "Oh, I came down last night on the all-night bus. I got off my shift. I work in the emergency room. And I came down here with all my sisters and brothers, and we're marching. First time I've ever been to Washington, D.C., she says. Oh, wow. She says, "Nice city. Nice. It's nice." So, you know, after the march, we're going to go lobby all our members of Congress. So we're going to have another rally on Capitol Hill. And then we have like 2 free hours to go to the Smithsonian before we get back on the bus, because I got to be back for my 3 o'clock shift tomorrow. I'm like, oh, boy. Wow. I said, "But I'm just curious, why are you here?" "Oh," she said, "oh. Well, you know, I told you I work in the emergency room. I have seen this economy coming into the emergency room on the bodies of my patients. They have come in with stress-related illnesses. They've come in having hurt themselves, or they've hurt somebody they love, or they've been hurt by somebody they love." She says, "Actually, the clincher for me was I was doing a little intake with this man. He was lying on a gurney. He's presenting with a heart attack. I said, 'What's your name?' She says, 'Mr. Thomas.' 'Mr. Thomas, where do you live?' He says, 'I just lost my house. That's why I'm having this chest pain.'" She stops and she looks at me. She says, "You see that enough? You realize it's not enough just to show up for your job every day. You got to get on the bus and come to Washington and do something about the greed that's corroding our country." "Have you ever heard of the Wall Street financial tax?" she says to me. I'm like, "Yeah, I've heard of it, but I've never heard it quite like that." So the good news is Eleanor got on the bus, and she's not alone. So thank you for coming tonight. Thank you.